Today, I want to talk about a topic that I think all Christians should be concerned about. I was talking with Larry Krause some months back, and a topic came up about how many people would be in attendance at Kittanning if all the people whom he had ever baptized were still in the area was attending. And he said we wouldn't have enough room. We wouldn't be able to seat everyone that would be here if they would just come. Now, granted, there are some that had passed on to their reward, and others that have moved away, sometimes for very legitimate reasons. But the sad truth is that for most of the people that are no longer worshiping with us down there, they still live in the area. They just fell away. They're just not coming. Today we're going to have a conversation about backsliding. Why does it happen? What are some of the reasons why people fall away? Is there anything we can do to safeguard against that happening to us? And what does the Bible say about that topic? In Jeremiah chapter 14, verse 7, in the scripture reading that was read to us, O Lord, though our iniquities testify against us, do thou it for thy name's sake, for our backslidings are many. We have sinned against thee. Israel was guilty of backsliding on many occasions, and if we're honest, we have a tendency to do that as well. Hosea chapter 4 and verse 16 says, For Israel slideth back as a backsliding heifer. Now the Lord will feed them as a lamb in a large place. I really like the imagery in that verse because I grew up on a farm, and I can tell you for a fact that it is quite difficult to get large animals to go somewhere they don't want to go. It talks about here a backsliding heifer. And I get almost the idea of a heifer that puts her front paws, or hooves out, and just, refuses to move. I don't know whether horses do that, Ray. Oh, they do? Okay, I figured they probably did. Because sometimes we can get comfortable with where we're at, and we resist moving away from that. In the Bible, when it talks about backsliding, the word that is used for backsliding in the Greek literally means to flinch or to go back. We all can have a potential inclination to backsliding, and we have that potential to stray from the Lord if we're not careful. Hosea chapter 11 and verse 7 says, And my people are bent to backsliding from me. Though they called them to the Most High, none at all would exalt him. In the song that we just sang, Oh, they found a very blessing, there's a verse that I think many of us can relate to. It's where it says, Prone to wonder, Lord, I feel it. Prone to leave the God I love. That's true. We are prone to stray. We have to guard against it. 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 12 tells us, Wherefore let him that thinketh he standeth take heed, lest we fall. Isn't it the truth that we all have to work at maintaining our faith, where we can start the process of falling away? If we're not growing, chances are we're heading in the opposite direction. So let's talk a little bit about how backsliding can begin. And many times, the people that are backsliding are the ones that are least able to see it. Larry has told me that sometimes he has watched people that he knew were falling away long before they ever actually stopped coming to services. But he was able to tell that something wasn't right. Galatians chapter 6 and verse 1 tells us, Brethren, if a man be overtaken in a fault, ye which are spiritual, restore such a one in a spirit of meekness, considering thyself, lest thou also be tempted. So often we're afraid of confrontation. It's one of the parts of the job of being an elder that I that I struggle with the most. I'm really not a contentious type person. I don't like to confront people, but sometimes I'm afraid we wait too long, and they get set in their ways, and we'd be better off confronting them early on, because they are beginning to fall away. So what are some of the things that we need to watch for in our lives that can give us some clues that we might be backsliding? The first thing is misplaced affections. Misplaced affections can be a dangerous thing. People tend to put their loyalty where their love is. My good wife, she doesn't understand me sometimes. Me and Larry Krause will get up in the middle of the night, and when we was out in Colorado, we was up at 3 a.m., went out in freezing temperatures. I'm talking out west when it's clear, up in the mountains, it gets cold, like real cold. And we were up at 3 o'clock in the morning climbing this hill at about 7,500 feet of elevation, all out of breath, falling down, freezing, and everything, to hunt elk, And my wife says, "Why would you do that?" Well, she says, "You have to be suffering if you're cold and shivering like that. And why do you hang in trees that are swaying like this with the wind blowing, rain dropping off your hat?" She doesn't see it. She doesn't get the same thrill of it. Well, why do Larry and I do it? We love it. I know it doesn't make any sense. I know that, but we love it. Because sometimes during that bad weather, that's when we'll come out, right? And Larry's worse at it than I am. Sometimes I'll freeze out, and I have to go back in and get him. He's stubborn. He's going to stay until, he says, "Brother, I'm going to stay till it's dark." "No, Larry, you're going to stay till it's pitch black." And I've had to go back in and get him. One time his tree stand got hung up in the tree, and he was stuck up there. And it was a good thing I did come back to get him, but anyway. But I say all that to say this. You do what you love to do, right? You do. And there are some things that we can love too much. Nothing wrong with hunting. Really enjoy it. But if Larry and I would be out hunting on a Wednesday night and blow off, midweek Bible study, then that becomes a problem. At that point, we're putting something else ahead of God, misplaced affections. In 2 Timothy chapter 3 and verse 2, it says, "For men shall be lovers of their own selves, covetous, boasters, proud, blasphemers, disobedient to parents, unthankful, and unholy." We have a constant battle going on inside us. And the question is who is going to win? Who's going to be the ultimate ruler of our lives? Every morning when I wake up, whether I realize it or not, there's a fight that's going on inside me. Who's going to be on the throne of my heart today, myself or God? And we all have to battle that. Sometimes we want to put our desires, our affections, ahead of the things that God wants for us. And we have to battle that. We have to fight that tendency where we might begin to start backsliding. In 1 Timothy chapter 6 and verse 10, it says, "For the love of money is the root of all evil, which while some coveted after, they have erred from the faith and pierced themselves through with many sorrows." We can love money and possessions too much. That can be a misplaced affection, and that can affect our relationship with God. But it doesn't have to. I know people that are quite well off, and they are great benefactors to the church. People that have resources to help the church and have the right attitudes toward them, some of the greatest blessing that a church can ever have. So there's nothing wrong with having, even a lot of money, as long as you have the right attitude towards it. It's possible for a person to have the wrong attitude toward money when they don't have any at all. David talked about, he hoped that God would put him in a situation where he didn't have too much, so he had learned to trust in the money, but also not too little, so that he would be all the time worried about, how he's going to make it through. He just wanted to live okay, live a reasonable, comfortable life, but keep God in first place. In Matthew chapter 6 and verse 24, Jesus talked about it. He says, "No man can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or else he will hold to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and mammon." It seems from this verse that what Jesus is saying, that loving material possessions and loving God are sort of mutually exclusive. Sort of can't do both at the same time. You're going to have to pick one or the other. And for too many people, they make a bad choice there. It's okay to have things and enjoy them. That's fine. But you cannot serve them with the same fervor as you serve God. That's when it becomes a problem. John chapter 3 and verse 19 says, "And this is the condemnation, that light is come into the world, and men love darkness rather than light, because their deeds are evil." We can fall in love with things that are of the darkness. Too many people these days have fallen in love with alcohol and drugs. There's a lot of things out there that people can get caught up in. Sin sometimes looks appealing. One of the best sermons I ever heard, Brother Larry talked about shiny billboards. You look on the front, they're all glossy, and they paint a picture of, boy, if you do this, you're really going to have fun. You're going to enjoy life. He says, but go behind the billboard, and it's got all kinds of cobwebs up among the rafters, and it's dirty. And that's the way sin is. It looks glossy up front. But when you get into it, that's when you start getting into the cobwebs and all the dirt and grime and the things that are not so good. In Matthew chapter 6 and verse 5, Jesus says, "And when thou prayest, thou shalt not be as the hypocrites are, for they love to pray standing in the synagogues and in the corners of the streets, that they may be seen of men. Verily I say unto you, they have their reward." Another thing that we can get caught up in is that we can have a misplaced affection on the praises of other men. We can go around and look at how religious I am. Look at how pious I am. I can do I do so much for the church. And that's a good thing, don't get me wrong. But people can get to a point where they take pride in that. They start to get to a point where they love the praises of men. And that happened to some of the Pharisees, didn't it? They wanted to be noted and noticed for how religious they were. So we have to be careful about that too. In 1 John chapter 2 and verse 15, it says, "Love not the world, neither the things that are in the world. If any man love the world, the love of the Father is not in him." And it's hard not to love the world, because there are some things in it that's very enticing. Some things that we really like. I'm reminded of all the enjoyable things that we have available to us in our lives, and we become impatient. Like, you can ask Jill; she'll tell you I do this too. If I get a little bit tired of what I'm watching, I'm there with that flicker, going to another place. Because we're always seeking for something else, something that'll give us more satisfaction, something that'll be better for us. In 2 Timothy chapter 3 and verse 4, it says, traitors, heady, high-minded, now notice this part, lovers of pleasure more than lovers of God. I think that's what happens to a lot of people. We have one family I'm working with down in Kittanning, good folks. They're just so busy. And they end up coming, once in a while. And I'll go and visit them, and they'll say, well, we're meaning to get there, we're just so busy. And I says, I understand being busy, I get that. But I said, if you're too busy for God, then you're more busy than He ever intended for you to be. We can get all wrapped up in all kinds of things, and they like to go. They have a camper, and they like to go, and they're just all the time out and about. And I have no problem with that once in a while. I really don't, but it's all the time, and they don't even see it. You get wrapped up in loving pleasure more than loving God. There is a reason we look forward to going on vacations. They're fun. I like to go and visit places as much as anybody. But we have to remember that we have to save time for God. There's so many things that are not wrong in and of themselves. Like we talked about hunting before. I like to fish too. I like to golf. I have all the bad habits, I guess. I like to do all those things. But if I let any one of them cause me to not do some of the work for God that I should be doing, then that's a problem. That's a problem. And we talked about misplaced affections. Another thing that can happen to us is we can misspend our time. Ephesians chapter 5 and verse 16 tells us, redeeming the time because the days are evil. Backsliding can occur when a child of God fails to make good use of his or her time for God. There's a lot of things that can eat up our time. Things that we don't even think about. The other day, I have this little app on my phone, that talks about how many hours a day I spend on it. Last week, I averaged 5 hours a day on this thing. I'm not going to any bad websites or anything. Just looking at football, during this time of year, looking at researching for hunting trips that Larry and I are thinking about taking out west, or whatever it is. I was on for that few days. Now, it's not always like that, but 5 hours. That's ridiculous. But we can do that. That's what happens when people, aren't aware of how they're using their time. I get on there and I play hearts or spades or whatever it is if I'm just sitting around. And sooner or later, I'm eating time. And, sometimes we think about the social media, we think that it's wrong, and it definitely is when people go to bad websites. But I'm going to suggest to you that it's possible for Christians to mess up with how much time they spend playing internet games, how much time they spend on Facebook, how much time they, someday we're going to have to give an account. I'm not saying you can't do it at all. It can't own you. And it's easy done. Trust me. It's real easy done. And that can cause us to backslide if we're not paying attention, to our time. Number 3, we can not go to services enough. The unattended church. In Hebrews chapter 10, verse 25, it says, not forsaking the assembling of ourselves together as the manner of some is, but exhorting one another, and so much the more as you see the day approaching. I've had some people that think that I was legalistic when I was talking to them about coming to church. And I always tell them, I says, it's not about how many times you come. It's the fact that you don't want to come. I don't understand why you don't want to be there. I'm not trying to force you to be there. That's not what it is. I'm struggling with why you don't want to come. Because you do the things you love to do. And when you don't come, what that's telling me, you don't love it enough. That's what it's saying. And I get myself into trouble sometimes with folks because that sort of puts it in perspective for them, and they don't really want to think about it that way, but that's what it is. You know, when you begin to frequently miss the services of the church for just the slightest reasons, it's a pretty sure sign, in my opinion, of backsliding. You know, one person told me one time that they had a good ways to drive, that they lived too far from church. I says, maybe you live too far from God. Maybe that's what it really is. You know, sometimes we just gotta, realize where our priorities is. You know, a backslider is a master at making excuses. That's what it really comes down to. Another thing that can happen is your prayer life. 1 Thessalonians chapter 5 and verse 17, it says, pray without ceasing. You know, if all of a sudden, I talk to Larry all the time, different times a week, what would happen if suddenly I never picked up his calls, never called him, for 2 or 3 weeks at a time, just never talked to him? What might he start thinking? He might wonder if somehow I was mad at him, or somehow that I was not his friend as much or something. He would wonder, wouldn't he? Yes, of course he would. Do you think that works that way with God? If we're not praying to him, if we're not talking to him, do you think he ever wonders, I wonder what's going on with them? And of course he knows. But when you put it in that perspective, we talk to the people that we enjoy. We talk to the people we love. And if we're not, it does beg the question, doesn't it? When you look at it that way, he gave us a book to read. He gave us an instruction manual, as I like to call it, for life. When we don't read it, what message does that send? Must not think it's that valuable. If not, why not? You know, I heard a story about how a preacher went to a family that had lost their little girl to drugs. She got caught up in things as a teenager, had got into drug use, and had finally taken her life. And the pastor asked if they could get their Bible, and he wanted to read a few verses to them from it when he visited with them. And when he opened it out, fell some yellowed papers and some dust. And he later said he knew why that girl had probably gotten involved with drugs, because they had never been opening the book. You know? Some quick symptoms of backsliding that you might be able to see in yourselves. If you ever start getting unhappy in services, start getting bored all the time. Now, some of that's a little bit natural. Have I ever done that? Have I ever dozed off? Yes, I have. And when I'm preaching and teaching class, I see this stuff every once in a while, where people start nodding and everything. Some of that's normal. But when you find yourself not enjoying services on a fairly regular basis, that's a symptom that you might be backsliding. And you need to get yourself in the book, get yourself back into a prayer life, because you should enjoy, for the most part. Everybody's going to have bad days, but most of the time you should enjoy participating in Bible studies and worship. If you don't, that's something that should be alarming to you. Another thing is when people are not as embarrassed as they should be about sin. You can have a passive indifference to sin if you're not careful. And we do it different ways. Satan's pretty good at causing us to rationalize sin in our lives, you know. Sometimes we disguise its appearance. You know, we hide the fact that we're dealing with sins in our lives. We're not very willing to confess it. And sin is sneaky, the way it works on you. It robs you of your good sense, and it makes promises to you that it can't possibly keep. Then, too, we get into debating its acceptability. But what is there to debate about immorality? What is there to debate about drunkenness? What is there to debate about lying? I've heard people sometimes talk about gray areas. Those areas that, well, I'm not sure if it's right or wrong. I have a test for people. I says, now, whatever you're thinking about doing, just imagine that Jesus would pop in right beside you. Would you participate in whatever you're going to do with him right beside you? Would you do it? Think about that. You know, it's sort of setting a trap. Think about that for a minute. People that hold the viewpoint, for example, they say, well, I think social drinking's okay. It's drunkenness is the problem. Fair enough. If you believe that, and Jesus would pop in right beside you, you'd be willing to offer him one. And somebody says, oh, wait a second. You can't do that. That's not integrity, folks. If you would not do it with Jesus standing beside you, then you should not do it, because actually he is, right? He is there. He is. That movie that has a little bit of racy scene in it, would you still watch that movie if he's sitting there watching it with you? And if you think you'd turn the channel, when he's there, you better do it when he's not there. Yeah, sometimes the gray areas are a lot less gray than we think they are sometimes, if you think about it in those terms. And sometimes we like to deflect our sin. Yeah, I'm guilty of that. But at least I'm not as bad as brother so-and-so. They do it a lot worse than I did. Does that change anything for you? Just because they're in trouble, that doesn't change the fact that you're in trouble too. It doesn't really help us, does it? Excuse me. Another thing that can cause us to backslide is when we get into a situation where we're not willing to forgive. Somebody makes a mistake and does something to us, and we just can't get past it. That can often cause us to go into backsliding as well. You know, backsliders sometimes have a rather sour spirit. They can become hard-headed, fault finders. Mark it down. If you find someone that's always seeing the things that are wrong with the church, they're a person that's not really happy in their faith. I ran into that one time. Someone was just running different people down and saying things, and I told him, I said, just one time, I would love to hear you say something about the church, what is right with the church. I'd love to hear that just one time. You know, sometimes we have to be honest with ourselves. We have to be also faithful in our stewardship. Not much reveals a man's spiritual temperature like his attitude towards his stewardship of money and time with the church. You know, I saw a bumper sticker one time that says, "If you love Jesus, honk." Have you ever seen them? Well, I saw another one I thought was cute. Someone says, "If you love Jesus, tithe. Any fool can honk." So I saw that one time and I thought that was pretty nice. Another thing that tells us a little bit about where our spirituality is our attitude toward the lost? If we're unconcerned about souls out there, maybe that's an indication that we're not as strong as we think we are in our faith. You know, we can become more concerned with things like, how long will the sermon last? You know, boy, Ben is being windy today, you know. We can come up with things like that. Or we can start thinking about, you know, I'm getting hungry. Wonder what's for lunch. I'll tell you a story. This is actually a bad thing of me, but in Honduras, I talked earlier, I think it was in Bible class, about the women that had walked over the mountains to study the Bible. And it was getting close to dinner time, and I knew that they were getting pizza and everything. I wanted to break. But see, they were hungry for spiritual things. No, let's keep studying. But I'm hungry, you know. But they had a better attitude than I did. I was worried about this. And they was worried about their spiritual things. You know, they were used to going hungry. You know, what they were hungry for was something different than I seemed to be hungry for in that day. So we have to be concerned about lost souls. You know, there's lots of spiritual illustrations in the Bible, and I'm not going to go into too much depth on them because we're running out of time, but think about Lot's wife. What happened to her? She loved, you know, what she had in her life in Sodom and Gomorrah, and she looked back, and it was a bad thing for her. You know, the Israelites in the wilderness often was complaining, we had it better back in Egypt, they would say. Did they really? I don't think so. You know, and in the desert, you'd think that any food at all, they'd be happy for it. But we're getting sick of this manna, now we want some flesh to eat. You know, there was often murmuring. Think about the tragedy of Demas, one of Paul's fellow workers. 2 Timothy chapter 4 and verse 10. For Demas has forsaken me, having loved this present world, and is departed unto Thessalonica, Crescens to Galatia, Titus unto Dalmatia. You know, for him to even have been working with the Apostle Paul, I'm going to suggest to you that Demas at one time had been a pretty good Christian. Or he probably wouldn't have even been traveling with Paul. But the world got to him, and he backslid and fell back. Anyone, even very good people, can fall into backsliding. In Revelation chapter 3 and verse 19, as many as I love, I rebuke and chasten. Be zealous, therefore, and repent. God will visit every backsliding child of God with chastisement, but will we accept it? The good news is there is mercy and forgiveness for backsliding. In Jeremiah chapter 3 and verse 22, it says, return ye backsliding children, and I will heal your backslidings. Behold, we come unto thee, for thou art the Lord our God. Proverbs chapter 28 verse 13 says, excuse me, like I said, I'm still dealing with this flu. He that covereth his sins shall not prosper, but whoso confesses and forsakes them shall have mercy. We just have to not fall into the trap of failure to admit the sins and the problems that we have. Have you fallen into backsliding today? Are you a stronger Christian today than you were a year ago? If not, ask the question, why not? And search your hearts. If you know you're falling back and you're not doing what you should, take care of that. Whether publicly or privately, whatever you need to do, take care of it. You know, as eternity's a long time. And we still have life. We still have opportunity right now. Make the most of it while we stand and sing to encourage you.